Samuel Hartley wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he guided his horse along the dusty trail that led back to his modest ranch. The Arizona sun blazed overhead, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and amber. His cattle had wandered farther than usual that morning, and it had taken him nearly 3 hours to round them up and guide them back toward safer grazing grounds. The year was 1887, and Samuel had been working his small ranch for nearly a decade. Unlike the wealthy cattle barons who owned vast spreads across the territory, Samuel's operation was humble. He ran maybe 200 head of cattle on land that barely sustained them during the dry seasons. His ranch house was a simple adobe structure he had built with his own hands, and his barn could shelter only a fraction of his livestock during the harsh winter months. As he crested a small hill, Samuel noticed something unusual in the distance. A thin column of smoke rose from behind a cluster of mesquite trees near the old water hole that marked the eastern boundary of his property. His first thought was that someone had started a campfire, which wasn't entirely unusual. Travelers occasionally passed through this remote part of the territory, and the water hole was one of the few reliable sources of fresh water for miles around. Samuel urged his horse forward, curiosity getting the better of him. As he approached the source of the smoke, he could hear voices speaking in a language he didn't recognize. When he finally got close enough to see through the trees, his heart nearly stopped. A group of Apache warriors sat around a small fire, their faces painted for what looked like a war party. Their horses stood nearby, and Samuel could see weapons gleaming in the firelight. Most men in Samuel's position would have turned their horses around and ridden hard for the nearest town or military outpost. Apache raids were still common in this part of Arizona territory, and encounters between white settlers and Apache war parties rarely ended well for the settlers. Samuel's own neighbors had warned him repeatedly about the dangers of living so far from civilization, especially after several ranches in the area had been attacked in recent months. But as Samuel watched the group more carefully, he noticed something that gave him pause. One of the warriors was clearly injured, lying on a blanket near the fire. The man's leg appeared to be badly wounded, and the others were tending to him with obvious concern. Samuel could see that they had torn strips of cloth from their clothing to bandage the wound, but it was clear that they lacked proper medical supplies. Samuel's Christian upbringing had instilled in him a deep belief that all human suffering deserved compassion, regardless of race or circumstances. His mother had been a frontier nurse who had treated everyone who came to their door, from cowboys to Mexican vaqueros to occasionally even members of various Native American tribes. She had taught him that pain and suffering were universal experiences that transcended cultural boundaries. Against every instinct for self-preservation, Samuel dismounted from his horse and stepped into the clearing. The Apache warriors immediately reached for their weapons, but Samuel raised both hands in a gesture of peace. He pointed to the wounded man and then to himself, trying to communicate through gestures that he wanted to help. The warriors spoke rapidly among themselves in their native language, clearly debating whether this white rancher represented a threat or an opportunity. The wounded warrior was obviously in severe pain, and Samuel could see that infection had already begun to set in around the wound. Without proper treatment, the man would likely die within days. Samuel had learned basic medical skills from his mother, and he had treated similar injuries among his ranch hands over the years. He knew he could help, but only if the Apache warriors would trust him enough to let him try. Slowly, Samuel walked back to his horse and retrieved his saddlebags. He pulled out a bottle of whiskey that he carried for emergencies, along with clean cloth bandages and a small bottle of carbolic acid that he used to treat cuts and wounds on his livestock. The Apache warriors watched his every movement, their hands never straying far from their weapons. Samuel knelt beside the wounded man and carefully examined the injury. A bullet had torn through the warrior's thigh, leaving a ragged wound that was clearly becoming infected. Samuel cleaned his hands with some of the whiskey and then began to clean the wound as gently as possible. The injured man gritted his teeth against the pain but didn't cry out. Working carefully, Samuel used the carbolic acid to disinfect the wound and then applied clean bandages. He showed the other warriors how to change the dressing and gave them the remaining medical supplies. Throughout the process, he spoke in calm, reassuring tones, even though he knew they probably couldn't understand his words. Somehow, his gentle manner seemed to communicate his peaceful intentions. When Samuel had finished treating the wound, the leader of the Apache group spoke to him in broken English. The man explained that they had been pursued by cavalry soldiers for several days after a misunderstanding at a trading post had led to violence. During their escape, the wounded warrior's horse had stumbled, throwing its rider and causing the injury when his leg struck a sharp rock. Samuel listened to the story without judgment. He had heard enough accounts from both sides to know that conflicts between Native Americans and white settlers were often the result of miscommunication and mutual distrust, rather than any inherent evil on either side. He also knew that this particular group of warriors was now far from their tribal lands and in desperate need of help. As the sun began to set, Samuel made a decision that would change his life forever. Instead of leaving the Apache warriors to fend for themselves, he invited them to bring their wounded companion to his ranch house. He explained through a combination of words and gestures that he had better medical supplies at home and could provide a safer place for the injured man to recover. The Apache leader studied Samuel's face for a long moment, searching for any sign of deception. Finally, he nodded his agreement. Together they carefully lifted the wounded warrior and placed him on a travois that they constructed from branches and rope. Samuel led the way back to his ranch, with the small group of Apache warriors following behind. When they reached Samuel's property, he immediately set about making his unexpected guests as comfortable as possible. He cleared out his barn to provide shelter for the warriors and their horses, and he brought blankets and food from his house. The wounded man was placed on a clean bed in Samuel's spare room, where Samuel could monitor his condition more closely. Over the next several days, Samuel tended to his patient with the same care he would have shown to any member of his own family. He changed bandages, administered herbal remedies that his mother had taught him to prepare, and ensured that the wounded warrior received plenty of water and nourishing food. Gradually, the infection began to clear, and the man's strength started to return. During this time, Samuel and the Apache warriors developed a mutual respect despite the language barriers between them. They shared meals together, and Samuel learned basic words in their language while teaching them some English phrases. He discovered that they were skilled horsemen and hunters, and they showed him techniques for tracking animals and reading signs in the desert that he had never learned. The wounded warrior, whose name Samuel learned was Running Wolf, proved to be an intelligent and thoughtful man. As his condition improved, he and Samuel began to communicate more effectively, with Running Wolf sharing stories about his people's traditional way of life and their struggles to survive in a world that was rapidly changing around them. Samuel began to understand that these men were not the savage raiders that newspapers and military reports often portrayed. They were fathers and sons, husbands and brothers who were fighting to protect their families and preserve their way of life. They had been forced onto reservations that could not sustain them, and they faced constant pressure from white settlers who wanted their remaining lands. As Running Wolf's health improved, Samuel knew that the time was approaching when his guests would need to leave. The Apache warriors were anxious to return to their families, and Samuel understood that their prolonged absence would cause worry among their loved ones. He also knew that his own safety depended on their departure before anyone else discovered their presence on his ranch. On the night before they planned to leave, Running Wolf asked to speak with Samuel privately. Through their improved communication, he explained that Samuel's kindness had created a debt that could only be repaid through the most sacred traditions of his people. Running Wolf told Samuel that he would carry word of the rancher's good deed back to his tribe, and that Samuel would forever be considered a friend and protector of the Apache people. Samuel protested that no repayment was necessary, that he had simply done what any decent human being would do when faced with another person's suffering. But Running Wolf insisted that such generosity could not go unrecognized among his people. He promised Samuel that if the rancher ever found himself in danger, the Apache would remember his kindness and come to his aid. The next morning, Samuel watched as the small group of warriors prepared to leave his ranch. Running Wolf's leg had healed enough for him to ride, though Samuel had fashioned a special stirrup to accommodate his still tender injury. The Apache leader approached Samuel one final time and clasped his hand in a gesture of friendship that needed no translation. As the warriors rode away into the desert morning, Samuel returned to his daily routine of tending cattle and maintaining his modest ranch. He told no one about his recent visitors, knowing that most of his neighbors would consider his actions foolish at best and treasonous at worst. The territorial government was actively campaigning against Apache resistance, and harboring warriors would be seen as aiding the enemy. In the weeks that followed, Samuel occasionally found small gifts left near his water sources, beautifully crafted arrowheads, intricately woven baskets, and sometimes fresh game that had been expertly prepared. He knew these tokens came from Apache visitors who had heard the story of his kindness toward Running Wolf and his companions. These gifts served as reminders that his good deed had created connections that extended far beyond his small ranch. Samuel continued his quiet life, unaware that word of his compassion was spreading throughout the Apache communities across the region. Running Wolf had kept his promise and shared the story of the kind rancher who had risked his own safety to help wounded enemies. The tale had taken on a life of its own, growing in the telling until Samuel Hartley had become something of a legend among the Apache people. As autumn arrived and the desert began to cool, Samuel noticed that his cattle were thriving better than ever before. Predators seemed to avoid his land, and he never lost animals to theft or mysterious disappearances that plagued other ranchers in the area. He attributed this good fortune to luck and careful management, never suspecting that Apache scouts were quietly protecting his property as a way of honoring the debt they owed him. Samuel's simple act of Christian charity had set in motion events that would soon test his faith and courage in ways he could never have imagined. The seeds of an extraordinary story had been planted, and they would soon bear fruit in the most unexpected and dramatic fashion. Winter had settled over the Arizona territory with unusual harshness that year, bringing bitter cold winds and occasional snow to the desert regions. Samuel Hartley had spent most of December preparing his ranch for the challenging months ahead, ensuring his cattle had adequate shelter and sufficient feed to survive until spring grass returned to the ranges. It was during this time that Samuel first noticed he was being watched. At first, he dismissed the feeling as imagination brought on by long days of solitary work. But as the weeks passed, he became increasingly aware of movements in the distance, shadows that seemed to shift among the rocks and scrub brush that dotted his property. When he rode out to investigate these disturbances, he found nothing but occasional hoof prints that could have belonged to wild horses or straying cattle. Samuel's nearest neighbor lived 15 miles to the south, and the small town of Cedar Springs was nearly a full day's ride to the east. This isolation had never bothered him before, but the persistent sense of being observed began to wear on his nerves. He found himself checking his weapons more frequently and scanning the horizon whenever he stepped outside his ranch house. The mystery deepened when Samuel began discovering clear signs that someone had been on his property during his absences. Gates that he was certain he had left closed would be standing open. Fresh water would appear in troughs that he knew had been empty the previous day. Most puzzling of all, he occasionally found evidence that someone had been caring for his cattle, repairing broken sections of fence, and even treating animals that showed signs of injury or illness. Samuel's confusion turned to genuine concern when he discovered that several of his cattle had been marked with symbols he didn't recognize. The marks were not brands in the traditional sense, but rather painted designs that appeared to have been applied with natural pigments. The symbols were intricate and clearly meaningful, though Samuel had no idea what they might signify. As January progressed, the signs of mysterious activity on Samuel's ranch became more frequent and more obvious. Whoever was watching him seemed to be growing bolder, or perhaps less concerned about being detected. Samuel found fresh campsites on the far reaches of his property, always carefully concealed but clearly used by experienced outdoorsmen. The camps showed evidence of careful planning and skilled woodcraft that impressed Samuel despite his growing unease. The situation took a dramatic turn on a particularly cold morning in late January. Samuel had risen before dawn to check on his cattle, concerned about several pregnant cows that were due to give birth soon. As he approached the area where he kept his breeding stock, he was shocked to discover that one of the cows had indeed given birth during the night, and the newborn calf was already cleaned, dried, and nursing successfully. More shocking still was the presence of a lone Apache warrior sitting quietly beside the mother and calf. The man made no threatening moves when Samuel appeared, but simply nodded respectfully and gestured toward the healthy animals. In broken English, he explained that the birth had been difficult and that he had assisted when the mother cow encountered complications that could have cost both their lives. Samuel recognized the man as one of Running Wolf's companions from the previous summer. Through their limited shared vocabulary, the warrior explained that he and others had been watching over Samuel's ranch throughout the winter, protecting his livestock and property as a way of continuing to honor the debt created by Samuel's kindness to their wounded brother. The warrior, who told Samuel his name was Gray Eagle, explained that their presence had not been meant to cause alarm. They had tried to remain completely hidden while still ensuring Samuel's safety and prosperity. However, the harsh winter and the increasing needs of Samuel's growing herd had required more direct intervention than they had originally intended. Samuel was deeply moved by this explanation, but he was also concerned about the implications of having Apache warriors camping on his property. Relations between white settlers and Native Americans remained tense throughout the territory, and discovery of this arrangement could lead to serious trouble for everyone involved. Military patrols regularly swept through the region, and Samuel knew that any evidence of Apache presence on his land could result in accusations of collaboration with hostile forces. Gray Eagle seemed to understand Samuel's concerns without needing detailed explanation. He assured the rancher that he and his companions were skilled at remaining invisible and that they would continue their protective activities without creating any risk for Samuel. He explained that they moved constantly, never staying in one place long enough to create permanent sign, and that they were always prepared to disappear completely if any threat approached the ranch. Over the following weeks, Samuel began to develop a deeper understanding of the sophisticated network that had formed around his property. Gray Eagle visited him regularly, always approaching openly and respectfully to coordinate their activities and ensure that their help was actually beneficial rather than disruptive. Samuel learned that different groups of Apache warriors took turns watching over his ranch, rotating duties so that no individual was away from his family for extended periods. The arrangement proved remarkably effective. Samuel's cattle had never been healthier or more secure. Predators were virtually eliminated from his range, and the mysterious helpers seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to anticipate and solve problems before Samuel was even aware they existed. Broken equipment would be repaired, sick animals would be treated, and potential hazards would be cleared away as if by magic. Samuel found himself developing genuine friendships with several of the Apache men who visited his ranch. Despite language barriers, they communicated effectively about ranching techniques, weather patterns, and the behavior of animals. Samuel was impressed by their deep knowledge of the land and their sophisticated understanding of animal behavior. In return, he shared what he had learned about cattle breeding and modern ranching methods. As winter gave way to spring, Samuel began to worry about the sustainability of this arrangement. He knew that increased activity on the range during the warmer months would make it much more difficult for his Apache friends to remain hidden. Neighboring ranchers would be moving cattle through the area more frequently, and the possibility of accidental discovery would increase dramatically. Samuel's concerns proved well-founded when he learned that the territorial government was planning a major military campaign against Apache communities throughout the region. Tensions had been escalating for months, and several violent incidents had convinced officials that decisive action was necessary to secure the territory for further white settlement. Gray Eagle brought Samuel disturbing news that military units were already moving into position for what promised to be the largest anti-Apache operation in the territory's history. The campaign was being planned in secret, but Apache scouts had detected the troop movements and recognized the signs of impending major action. Gray Eagle explained that his people were preparing for what might be a final struggle for their survival as a free people. Samuel was horrified by this news, not only because of his friendship with the Apache men who had helped him, but because he understood that such a campaign would likely result in tremendous suffering on both sides. He had seen enough violence during his years in the territory to know that military campaigns against Native Americans typically resulted in casualties among women and children as well as warriors, and that the cycle of revenge and retaliation that followed such actions could continue for years. Gray Eagle asked Samuel to keep this information confidential, explaining that any warning to white settlers about the impending campaign could result in changes to military plans that might make the situation even more dangerous for Apache communities. Samuel agreed to maintain secrecy, though he struggled with the moral implications of remaining silent while his neighbors faced potential danger. As spring progressed, Samuel noticed that the Apache presence around his ranch was gradually diminishing. Gray Eagle explained that the warriors were being recalled to help defend their families and communities against the coming military campaign. Samuel understood that his friends were facing a crisis that made their protection of his ranch a luxury they could no longer afford. The last visit from Gray Eagle came on a warm April morning when the desert was beginning to show the first signs of spring growth. The Apache warrior arrived at Samuel's ranch house looking tired and deeply troubled. He explained that the military campaign was about to begin and that this would likely be their final meeting for the foreseeable future. Gray Eagle thanked Samuel once again for his kindness to Running Wolf and explained that the Apache people would never forget the debt they owed to the kind rancher. He promised that if circumstances ever permitted, they would find a way to repay Samuel's generosity in full. However, he warned that the coming months would be dangerous for everyone in the territory, and he advised Samuel to be extremely cautious in his dealings with both military forces and any Native Americans he might encounter. As Gray Eagle prepared to leave, he handed Samuel a beautifully crafted leather pouch containing what appeared to be ceremonial items. He explained that these were sacred objects that would identify Samuel as a friend to any Apache warrior who might encounter him in the future. Gray Eagle warned Samuel to keep the pouch hidden from white authorities, as possession of Apache ceremonial items could be interpreted as evidence of collaboration with hostile forces. Samuel watched as Gray Eagle disappeared into the morning mist, knowing that he might never see his Apache friend again. The ranch felt strangely empty after months of knowing that protective guardians were watching over his property. Samuel realized that he had grown accustomed to the sense of security that came from having skilled warriors ensuring his safety, and their absence left him feeling more vulnerable than ever. In the days following Gray Eagle's departure, Samuel tried to return to his normal routine of managing his ranch independently. However, he found it difficult to concentrate on mundane tasks while knowing that his friends were facing a life-or-death struggle somewhere in the desert. He listened carefully for any news about military actions against Apache communities, but information was scarce and often contradictory. Samuel's isolation was broken when a cavalry patrol arrived at his ranch in early May. The soldiers were conducting a systematic search of all ranches and settlements in the region, looking for any evidence of Apache presence or collaboration with hostile forces. Samuel answered their questions honestly but carefully, making no mention of his recent Apache visitors or the assistance they had provided to his ranching operation. The patrol leader was a young lieutenant who seemed eager to prove his competence in dealing with what he clearly viewed as a dangerous frontier situation. He questioned Samuel extensively about any unusual activity in the area and warned him to report any contact with Apache individuals immediately. The lieutenant made it clear that failure to report such contact could result in serious legal consequences for Samuel. After the patrol departed, Samuel felt increasingly isolated and anxious about the situation developing around him. He knew that his ranch was located in an area that would likely see significant military activity during the coming campaign, and he worried about how he would respond if asked to actively assist in actions against his Apache friends. Samuel had never considered himself a particularly brave man, but he knew that his conscience would not allow him to betray people who had shown him such kindness and loyalty. Samuel's worries were compounded by disturbing reports that began filtering in from other parts of the territory. Military units were conducting aggressive patrols and raids against suspected Apache camps, often with little regard for distinguishing between hostile warriors and peaceful community members. Samuel heard accounts of families being separated and communities being destroyed, and he couldn't help but wonder about the fate of Running Wolf, Gray Eagle, and the other men who had become his friends. As summer approached, Samuel prepared himself for what he feared might be a very dangerous period. He had no idea that events were already in motion that would test his courage and convictions in ways he could never have imagined. The debt of gratitude he had created through his simple act of kindness was about to be repaid in the most dramatic and unexpected manner possible. The trouble began on a sweltering July morning when Samuel awoke to the sound of distant gunfire echoing across the desert. He had been expecting something like this for weeks, as military patrols had become increasingly frequent in the area and tensions between soldiers and Apache communities had reached a breaking point. What Samuel didn't expect was to find himself directly in the path of a running battle between a large Apache war party and 2 companies of cavalry soldiers. Samuel had barely finished his morning chores when he spotted dust clouds on the horizon, moving rapidly in his direction. Through his field glasses, he could see mounted warriors and soldiers engaged in a running firefight that stretched across several miles of desert terrain. The Apache fighters were clearly outnumbered, but they were using their superior knowledge of the terrain to avoid direct confrontation while harassing the pursuing cavalry with hit-and-run tactics. As the battle drew closer to his ranch, Samuel realized with growing alarm that both groups were heading directly toward his property. His ranch house sat in a strategic position near one of the few reliable water sources in the region, and Samuel knew that both sides would likely try to control this valuable resource. He faced a terrible dilemma. He could try to flee and abandon everything he had worked for, or he could stay and risk being caught in the crossfire of a major military engagement. Samuel's decision was made for him when he spotted a familiar figure among the Apache warriors. Running Wolf, the man whose life Samuel had saved nearly a year earlier, was leading a group of fighters in a desperate retreat toward the water hole on Samuel's property. Even at a distance, Samuel could see that Running Wolf had been wounded again, and that several of his companions were also injured. Without thinking about the consequences, Samuel ran to his barn and began preparing supplies that the wounded men would need. He filled every container he could find with fresh water and gathered all the medical supplies he had accumulated since his previous encounter with Apache warriors. Samuel knew that helping Running Wolf would make him a traitor in the eyes of the military, but he couldn't bring himself to abandon men who had risked their lives to protect his ranch throughout the winter. The Apache war party reached Samuel's ranch about 30 minutes ahead of the pursuing cavalry. Running Wolf and his warriors approached the ranch house cautiously, clearly uncertain about whether Samuel could be trusted in this desperate situation. When Samuel emerged from his house carrying medical supplies and water, Running Wolf's face showed obvious relief and gratitude. Samuel quickly assessed the situation and realized that several warriors were seriously wounded and would not be able to continue their retreat without immediate medical attention. He invited the Apache fighters to bring their wounded into his barn, where they could receive treatment and concealment from the approaching cavalry. Running Wolf initially protested, explaining that accepting this help would put Samuel in terrible danger, but Samuel insisted that he couldn't stand by and watch injured men suffer when he had the ability to help them. Working frantically against time, Samuel and several of the uninjured warriors transformed his barn into a makeshift hospital. They created concealed spaces behind hay bales and grain sacks where wounded men could be hidden, and they prepared defensive positions in case the cavalry discovered their presence. Samuel contributed his medical knowledge while the Apache fighters provided their expertise in camouflage and defensive tactics. The cavalry arrived at Samuel's ranch just as they finished preparing their concealed positions. Samuel walked out to meet the soldiers, trying to appear as calm and normal as possible while knowing that nearly 20 Apache warriors were hidden just yards away. The military commander, a grizzled colonel named Harrison, was clearly frustrated by his inability to catch the Apache war party and was determined to search every building on Samuel's property. Colonel Harrison questioned Samuel aggressively about any sign of Apache presence in the area. Samuel answered truthfully that he had seen the war party pass through, but claimed they had continued toward the mountains without stopping. The colonel was clearly skeptical of this account and ordered his men to conduct a thorough search of Samuel's buildings and property. Samuel's heart pounded as soldiers began systematically examining his barn, poking through hay bales and checking every corner for signs of hidden enemies. The Apache warriors remained completely motionless in their concealed positions, demonstrating the incredible discipline and self-control that had made them such effective fighters. Samuel marveled at their ability to remain silent even when soldiers passed within inches of their hiding places. The search continued for over an hour, with Colonel Harrison becoming increasingly frustrated by his failure to find any trace of the Apache war party. Samuel maintained his story consistently, explaining that he was simply a peaceful rancher who wanted nothing more than to be left alone to tend his cattle. He offered the soldiers water and food, playing the role of a hospitable frontier citizen who was eager to cooperate with military authorities. Finally, Colonel Harrison concluded that the Apache fighters had indeed continued their retreat toward the distant mountains. He warned Samuel to report any further Apache activity immediately and promised that military patrols would maintain a regular presence in the area. As the cavalry prepared to resume their pursuit, Samuel felt a mixture of relief and terror about what would happen next. Once the soldiers had disappeared in the distance, Samuel and the Apache warriors emerged from their concealment and assessed their situation. Several of the wounded men were in serious condition and would need extensive care before they could travel safely. Samuel realized that he had committed himself to harboring Apache fighters indefinitely, making him a wanted man if his actions were ever discovered. Running Wolf approached Samuel and spoke with deep emotion about the debt that could never be fully repaid. He explained that Samuel's willingness to risk everything to help Apache warriors had elevated him to a position of tremendous honor among their people. Running Wolf promised that word of Samuel's courage would be carried to every Apache community in the region, and that Samuel would forever be considered a brother to their nation. Over the following days, Samuel's ranch became a secret sanctuary for wounded Apache fighters. Warriors arrived throughout the week, some carrying additional wounded men who had been injured in other skirmishes with military forces. Samuel found himself caring for nearly 30 patients while trying to maintain the appearance of running a normal ranching operation. The logistics of concealing and caring for so many people proved incredibly challenging. Samuel had to carefully ration his food supplies while ensuring that all his patients received adequate nutrition for healing. Water, always precious in the desert, became an even more critical resource. Most difficult of all, Samuel had to find ways to dispose of the evidence of medical treatment without leaving traces that might be discovered by military patrols. Samuel's Apache guests proved to be ideal patients and helpers. They endured pain without complaint, assisted with each other's care, and contributed their knowledge of traditional healing methods to supplement Samuel's medical supplies. Several of the warriors were skilled craftsmen who used their recovery time to repair equipment and improve the ranch's facilities. Samuel was amazed by their ingenuity and resourcefulness in making the most of limited materials. As the wounded men gradually recovered, Samuel began to understand the full scope of the military campaign being waged against Apache communities throughout the region. The warriors brought reports of villages being burned, families being separated, and leaders being captured or killed. Samuel realized that he was witnessing what might be the final chapter in the Apache people's struggle to maintain their independence and traditional way of life. The situation at Samuel's ranch became even more complex when Running Wolf informed him that additional Apache leaders were planning to visit the ranch to meet the white man who had shown such extraordinary courage and compassion. Running Wolf explained that Samuel's actions had become legendary among Apache communities, and that many people wanted to see for themselves the rancher who had risked everything to help their wounded warriors. Samuel was both honored and terrified by this prospect. He understood that hosting Apache leaders would make his ranch an even more valuable target for military action, but he also recognized that refusing such a visit would be deeply insulting to people who had shown him great respect and trust. He agreed to the meeting while knowing that he was taking an enormous risk that could cost him his life. The Apache delegation arrived at Samuel's ranch on a moonless night in early August. The group included several prominent war chiefs and medicine men, along with their personal guards and advisors. Samuel was awed by the dignity and presence of these men, who carried themselves with the bearing of natural aristocrats, despite their desperate circumstances. The formal meeting took place in Samuel's barn, which had been arranged as a council chamber for the occasion. Running Wolf served as translator and intermediary, helping Samuel understand the formal protocols that governed such gatherings. Samuel was presented with gifts that represented the highest honors that Apache society could bestow upon a non-Apache individual. The war chief spoke at length about Samuel's actions and their significance within Apache cultural traditions. They explained that his willingness to risk his own safety to help wounded enemies had demonstrated a level of courage and moral character that commanded universal respect among their people. Samuel was formally adopted as an honorary member of the Apache Nation and given a new name that translated roughly as "He Who Heals with Courage." During the ceremony, the Apache leaders made a commitment that would prove to be both a blessing and a burden for Samuel. They promised that the Apache Nation would forever consider Samuel and his property to be under their protection. Any threat to Samuel's safety or prosperity would be considered an attack upon the Apache people themselves and would be met with the full force of their collective response. Samuel was deeply moved by these honors and commitments, but he was also concerned about the practical implications of being so closely identified with Apache interests. He knew that his association with these leaders would make him a high-priority target for military action if it were ever discovered. He also worried about the burden he might be placing on Apache communities by accepting their protection when they were already struggling for their own survival. The Apache delegation remained at Samuel's ranch for 3 days. during which they conducted additional ceremonies and strategic planning sessions. Samuel learned that the military campaign against Apache communities was entering a critical phase, with government forces preparing for a final push that was intended to force all remaining Apache people onto designated reservations. The war chiefs were developing plans for a coordinated resistance that would require tremendous sacrifice from all Apache communities. As the delegation prepared to leave Samuel's ranch, Running Wolf provided him with detailed instructions for how to contact Apache communities if he ever needed their assistance. Samuel was given signal methods and recognition symbols that would identify him as a protected friend to any Apache warrior he might encounter. He was also warned about the signs that would indicate approaching danger and the procedures he should follow to ensure his own safety. Samuel watched the Apache leaders disappear into the pre-dawn darkness, knowing that he might never see them again. The ranch felt strangely quiet after days of intense activity and emotion. Samuel realized that his life had been permanently changed by the events of the past week, and that he could never return to the simple existence he had enjoyed before becoming involved in the Apache struggle for survival. In the weeks that followed, Samuel tried to return to his normal ranching routine while remaining alert for signs of military activity in the area. He knew that cavalry patrols were still searching for evidence of Apache presence, and he carefully concealed all traces of his recent visitors. Samuel's livestock had thrived during the period when Apache warriors were protecting his ranch, and he now had one of the most successful operations in the region. Samuel's peaceful interlude was shattered on a crisp morning in late August when he awoke to discover that his ranch was completely surrounded by Apache warriors. For a moment, Samuel feared that something had gone wrong and that he was about to face the consequences of his involvement in Apache affairs. However, as his eyes adjusted to the early morning light, he realized that the warriors were facing outward from his ranch, not inward toward his buildings. Running Wolf appeared at Samuel's door and quickly explained the situation. Apache scouts had discovered that a massive cavalry force was approaching the ranch with orders to arrest Samuel on charges of collaborating with hostile forces. The military had finally gathered enough evidence to prove Samuel's involvement with Apache communities, and they were coming to take him into custody for trial and probable execution. Running Wolf explained that the Apache leadership had decided to honor their commitment to protect Samuel by preventing his capture. Nearly 1,000 Apache warriors from communities throughout the region had answered the call to defend the man who had shown such courage and compassion toward their people. They had surrounded Samuel's ranch during the night and were prepared to fight off the approaching cavalry force. Samuel was overwhelmed by this demonstration of loyalty and gratitude, but he was also horrified by the potential consequences. He knew that a battle between 1,000 Apache warriors and military forces would result in tremendous casualties on both sides and might trigger an even more destructive phase of the territorial conflict. Samuel tried to convince Running Wolf that such a sacrifice was unnecessary, but the Apache leader explained that this was a matter of honor that could not be negotiated. As the sun rose higher, Samuel could see the approaching dust cloud that marked the advance of the cavalry force coming to arrest him. He estimated that the military had deployed at least 300 soldiers for this operation, suggesting that they were taking his capture very seriously. Samuel realized that the next few hours would determine not only his own fate, but possibly the future of Apache resistance throughout the region. Standing on his porch and looking out at the hundreds of Apache warriors who had come to protect him, Samuel understood that his simple act of Christian charity had set in motion events that neither he nor anyone else could have predicted. The debt of gratitude created by his decision to help a wounded enemy had grown into something far beyond his ability to comprehend or control. Samuel faced the dawn knowing that he was about to witness either a miracle or a tragedy, and that his own actions had made both possibilities equally likely.